The day Anna Maddox arrived in Rattlesnake Flats, Texas, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and every soul in town stopped what they were doing to stare at the woman stepping down from the stagecoach with nothing but a battered leather trunk, a rifle she clearly knew how to use, and eyes that dared the whole frontier to try her. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Rattlesnake Flats sat like a stubborn splinter in the heel of the Texas Panhandle, too mean to die and too proud to grow. The main street was a corridor of dust and ambition, flanked by a general store, a saloon called the Copper Penny, a blacksmith shop that smelled of scorched iron, a small church whose congregation dwindled every Sunday, and a land office where men made promises the earth rarely kept. The population hovered somewhere around 300 souls, depending on who had ridden in and who had ridden out that week, and newcomers were regarded with the same cautious appraisal one might give a horse of uncertain temperament. Anna was 24 years old, and she had come west with a purpose that she kept folded up tight inside her chest like a letter she was not yet ready to read aloud. Her father, James Maddox, had staked a homestead claim on 300 acres of grassland east of town 3 years prior, and his letters home to Missouri had been full of optimism and color. Then the letters had stopped. The last one, which arrived in November, had mentioned a man named Holt Greer, a cattle baron who was buying up land in the territory with the patience of a man who believed everything eventually had a price. James Maddox had written that he intended to hold his ground. He had signed that letter with 3 underscores beneath his name, a habit he only used when he was frightened. Anna had not heard from him since. She had waited through winter, written to the county sheriff, received a thin reply stating that her father was in good health as far as anyone knew, and finally decided that waiting was a form of cowardice she could not afford. She had packed her things, sold the furniture her mother had left behind when she died 7 years prior, tucked the money into her boot, and bought a ticket west. The stagecoach driver handed down her trunk with the careful expression of a man who had already decided she was going to be someone else's problem. The handful of men loitering outside the Copper Penny watched her from under their hat brims with the particular mixture of curiosity and wariness that a lone woman on the frontier tended to inspire. Anna adjusted the strap of her rifle across her shoulder and looked down the street until she found what she was looking for, the painted sign above a narrow building that read, Thatcher Tracking and Scouting Services, Experienced Guide, Reasonable Rates, Apply Within. She had read about the service in a letter from the county land office agent, who had suggested that if she was going to ride out to the Maddox claim without knowing the terrain, she had better hire a guide who did. The agent had mentioned Cornelius Thatcher specifically, had written that the man knew the Panhandle the way other men knew their own hands, and that he had a reputation for honesty in a place where honesty was nearly as rare as rain. Anna picked up her trunk with one hand and walked toward that sign without looking back at the men who were still watching her. The inside of the building was smaller than the sign suggested, just a front room with a wooden counter, a rack of maps pinned to the wall, a cold iron stove, and the smell of leather and wood smoke that had soaked so deeply into the walls it had become part of the architecture. A dog of indeterminate breed was asleep under the counter. A man was standing at the far wall with his back to the door, studying one of the maps with his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly to the left, as though listening to something the map was trying to tell him. He was tall, lean without being spare, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn canvas shirt and shoulders that carried their width without apology. He wore a revolver on his right hip, holstered low and easy in the manner of a man who hoped he would not need it but had made his peace with the possibility. When he turned around at the sound of the door, Anna saw that he was perhaps 28 or 30, with a square jaw that was a day past a shave, dark eyes that were both direct and patient, and a mouth that looked like it could belong to either a kind man or a very certain one. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she looked back at him with the same careful inventory. "I am looking for Cornelius Thatcher," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with a Texas undercurrent that softened the consonants without losing any of the substance beneath them. "What can I do for you, Miss Maddox? Anna Maddox." She set her trunk down on the floor, and the dog opened one eye, decided she was not interesting, and went back to sleep. "My father is James Maddox. He has a homestead claim east of town, out past Coyote Creek. I have not been able to reach him by letter in 5 months, and I am riding out there. I was told you know the terrain and that you are trustworthy, which is a combination I am told is difficult to find in this part of Texas." Cornelius Thatcher was quiet for a moment. He had one of those faces that was doing a great deal of thinking, without showing more than a fraction of it, and Anna found herself wondering whether that was a quality she should find reassuring or maddening. He uncrossed his arms and moved to the counter. "I know the Maddox claim," he said, and something in his voice shifted just slightly, a density that had not been there before. "Your father, I have seen him in town a few times. Last time was maybe 2 months ago. He looked thin." 2 months ago, Anna repeated. "So he was alive 2 months ago." "He was alive," Cornelius confirmed. "But I won't tell you he looked entirely well, Miss Maddox. There has been some trouble out that way. Holt Greer's outfit has been putting pressure on the small landholders east of the creek. I won't pretend otherwise." She appreciated that. Men who told women comfortable lies about difficult things had always irritated her, and she let that appreciation settle into her expression just enough for him to notice. "What is your rate?" she asked. "$1 a day, plus I need to know the full story of what I'm riding into," he said. "I don't take jobs blind. That's not stubbornness, it's just how I keep myself alive." "Fair enough," she said. "Sit down, then. I'll tell you everything I know." They sat across from each other at the small table in the corner of the room, and Anna talked while Cornelius listened in the still and complete way of a man who was genuinely hearing every word. She told him about the letters, about her father's mention of Holt Greer, about the silence that had followed. She told him that James Maddox was 53 years old, a stubborn and capable man who had homesteaded 3 separate times in his life, and had never once walked away from land he believed in. She told him about the rifle, that her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12 because he had believed in self-sufficiency with the fervor of a religion. She did not tell him that she was frightened, but she suspected he knew anyway. When she finished, Cornelius was quiet for a breath or two, his hands flat on the table in a way that was easy without being careless. "Greer has about 40 riders," he said. "Most of them are just cowhands doing a job, but he has a handful of men who work as something closer to enforcers. Man named Dylan Walsh runs that side of his operation. You should know that going in." "I'm not planning to go to war with Holt Greer," Anna said. "I'm planning to find my father." "Sometimes those end up being the same thing out here," Cornelius said, but he said it without drama, just as a fact to be filed away. "Are you going to take the job?" she asked. He looked at her for another one of those long, thoughtful moments, and she had the distinct impression he was deciding something that had less to do with the job and more to do with her, though not in any way she found unwelcome. There was something in the look that was calibrating, sizing up not her physical presence but her character, the way a good horse trader assessed what was really underneath the surface of an animal. "Yes," he said. "We leave at first light." Anna nodded. She stood, picked up her trunk, and looked around the room. "Is there a boarding house in this town that won't require me to explain myself to every guest at supper?" The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the structural foundation of one. "Mrs. Henley on the north end of Main Street," he said. "She minds her own business and cooks a good breakfast." "Thank you, Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Cornelius," he said. "If we're riding together, Mr. Thatcher is going to get old fast." "Anna, then," she said, and she picked up her trunk and walked out into the purple evening of Rattlesnake Flats. She lay awake that night in Mrs. Henley's narrow, upstairs room with the window cracked to let in the prairie wind, listening to the coyotes talk to each other in the dark, and thinking about her father's handwriting on that last letter. The way the pen had pressed harder than usual into the page, as though he had been trying to make the words last. Cornelius was already at the livery when she arrived before dawn, saddling a big roan gelding with the practiced economy of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He looked up when she walked in, took in the fact that she was dressed sensibly in a split riding skirt, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying her rifle and a canvas saddlebag that was clearly packed with careful thought rather than panic. He nodded once, the way a man nods when something meets the standard he had privately set, and went back to the saddle cinch. The livery owner, a leathery man named Elwood, had a horse waiting for Anna, a sturdy paint mare named Clover who regarded the pre-dawn darkness with philosophical indifference. Anna checked the saddle herself, adjusted the stirrups, and packed her bag into the left saddle ring without asking for help, and Cornelius watched this from the corner of his eye and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. They rode out of Rattlesnake Flats as the sky was just beginning to separate from the dark, a thin line of gray rose at the horizon that promised the day without yet delivering it. The terrain east of town was flat and vast in that particular way of the Texas Panhandle, where the land spread itself in every direction like something that had decided there was no point in being subtle about its scale. The grasses were winter brown but beginning to show the first feathers of spring green, and the air had that crystalline quality of early morning that made the world feel temporarily honest. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour, which Anna appreciated. She had met men who filled silence with themselves, who talked not because they had something to say but because quiet made them uneasy, and she had always found those men exhausting. Cornelius rode beside her with the ease of someone for whom the land was a familiar room, his eyes moving regularly across the horizon and the middle distance with the automatic watchfulness of a man accustomed to reading landscape for information. About an hour out, he pointed at a line of distant hills and told her the shortest route to Coyote Creek. He told her where the old Comanche trails ran and why even now, in 1874, it was wise to know them. He told her that the spring before last had been terrible and dry, and that the creek itself might be running low. He said these things with the same matter-of-fact tone he had used the evening before, and Anna found herself listening not just to the information but to the voice that carried it, the particular steadiness of it. "How long have you been in Rattlesnake Flats?" she asked. 6 years, he said. "Came down from New Mexico with a surveying crew and liked the country enough to stay." "What did you do before the surveying?" "Scouted for the army for a while," he said, and something in his voice closed slightly, not with hostility but with the careful economy of a man who had learned to keep certain rooms locked. "Before that I was a cowhand on a cattle drive out of Abilene. Before that I was 18 years old and thought I knew what I was doing, which is its own education." Anna smiled at that, the first real smile since she had arrived. "Were you from Texas originally?" "Virginia," he said, and he said it the same way a man says the name of a place that is not home anymore but used to be. "My people were farmers. After the war there was not a great deal to farm. I was 12 when it ended and old enough to know that the future was going to be somewhere west of what I was standing on." Anna looked at him, at the profile of his face against the brightening sky. "My father said something like that. He said Missouri after the war was a map of everything that had burned. He came west for the same reason." Cornelius turned and looked at her, and for just a moment there was something unguarded in his expression, a recognition that was quick and warm before it settled back into its characteristic patience. "How long ago did he come out?" 3 years, she said. "He wrote to me every 2 weeks, regular as the mail could manage. He wrote about the grass and the sky, and how the prairie sunrises made a man feel like he was standing at the beginning of the world. He wrote about his plans for the spring planting." She paused. "He is a man who loves the land he is on. He would not have abandoned it." "No," Cornelius said. "I don't believe he would." They reached Coyote Creek at mid-morning, a silver thread of water running through a gully lined with cottonwood trees that were just beginning to leaf out in the tender, sticky green of early spring. Cornelius called a halt and watered the horses while Anna ate a piece of the corn bread she had brought from Mrs. Henley's and looked at the tracks in the soft mud along the creek bank. "Those are fresh," Cornelius said, crouching near a cluster of hoofprints. 2 days, maybe 3, shod horses, so not wild, 6 of them. He stood. "The Maddox claim is about 4 miles northeast from here." "Greer's men?" Anna asked. "Possibly," he said, and his voice was careful. "Could be any number of things, but I want you to stay close to me from here forward. Whatever we find out there, we find it together and we don't do anything rash." "I did not come all this way to be rash," she said. "I came to find my father." "Good," he said, and the steadiness in his voice was something she was already beginning to rely on without fully realizing it. They crossed the creek and rode through grassland that grew gradually more cultivated, the evidence of human effort in the straight lines of a fence row that had partly fallen, a windmill turning slowly in the morning wind, a wagon road that had been used often enough to leave permanent tracks in the earth. The fields were not planted yet, but the ground had been turned in long dark rows that smelled of rich soil and intention, and Anna felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of that preparation, the proof that her father had been here recently enough to be thinking about the future. The farmhouse appeared at the top of a low rise, a solid, unpretentious structure of raw timber and sod with a covered porch and a stone chimney from which a thin wisp of smoke was rising. Anna's heart turned over hard. "Smoke," she said. "I see it," Cornelius said, and he had already put his hand to the revolver at his hip, not drawing it but confirming its presence. "Let's ride in easy and see what greets us." They had covered half the distance to the house when the front door opened, and a man appeared on the porch, and Anna pressed her heels into Clover's sides before she had finished thinking about it. She covered the remaining ground at a canter and was out of the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, and the man on the porch caught her because she hit him like a wave. James Maddox was thinner than she remembered, and there was gray at his temples that had not been there when she had last seen him, and he had the look of a man who had spent the winter fighting something. But his arms were solid and his grip was strong, and he said her name into her hair with a fierceness that made the 5 months of silence and fear collapse into something bearable. "I wrote to you," she said against his shoulder. "I wrote 3 letters after yours stopped coming." "I never got them," he said. "I think my mail has not been getting through. Greer's man rides with the postal writer sometimes." There was a tight anger in his voice, but also a careful control of it, the control of a man who had been managing his outrage for a long time. He held her back at arm's length and looked at her face. "You should not be here, Anna." "I am exactly where I should be," she said. Cornelius had dismounted and was waiting at the bottom of the porch steps with his hat in his hand, and James Maddox looked at him over Anna's shoulder with an expression that shifted through several things before arriving at a cautious gratitude. "Cornelius Thatcher," James said. "Mr. Maddox," Cornelius said. "I am glad you're standing." "I am glad to be standing," James replied, and the joke was dark enough to be a window into what the winter had been. Inside, the farmhouse was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular domestic order of a man living alone, who was maintaining standards as an act of dignity. James made coffee and set out bread and salt pork, and the 3 of them sat at the rough table and he told them about the winter. Greer's men had begun with the official channels, offers to buy, lowball figures delivered by lawyers from San Antonio who made a 3-day ride seem like a civilized transaction. When James had refused, the offers became suggestions, and the suggestions became pressure. 2 of his neighbors, the Harlan family and old Marcus Webb, had taken money and gone. Their land now ran Greer's cattle. James had held on, but in January, his plow horse had turned up dead. In February, his water had been contaminated with something that had made him sick for 2 weeks. In March, a portion of his south fence had been torn down in the night, and 40 of Greer's steers had trampled his winter wheat. He had filed a complaint with the county sheriff, whose office was in Caldwell, a day's ride away. The complaint had been received with a sympathy that produced no action. The sheriff, it was understood, owed several political favors to men who were in turn obligated to Holt Greer, and in 1874 Texas, that was a chain that kept the wheel turning in whatever direction Greer preferred. Anna listened to all of this with a contained fury that she felt in her jaw and her hands, and the deliberate way she kept her breathing even. Cornelius listened with the map-reading attention he brought to everything, his eyes on James Maddox's face, mentally cataloging the facts. "What does Greer want in the end?" Anna asked. "This land specifically," James said. "There is a reason beyond the grass. There is water here. There are 3 springs on this claim that don't dry up even in the worst summer. For a cattle operation the size he is running, that is the difference between profit and ruin. He wants this land because without my water his herd cannot grow the way he intends." "Can you prove the interference?" Cornelius asked. "The horse, the water, the fence." "I have documentation," James said. "I have kept a journal since January. Every incident, every date, every witness if there was one." He looked at Cornelius with the assessment of a man who had survived long enough to know the difference between allies and acquaintances. But knowing and proving in a court are different animals in this county. "They are," Cornelius agreed. "But the journal is important. Keep it safe." That evening, sitting on the porch as the sun went down in a spectacle of orange, and rose that the Texas Panhandle did with a lavishness that seemed almost theatrical, Anna and Cornelius talked while James rested inside. The day's ride and the emotional weight of finding her father had settled into something quieter, and she was aware of Cornelius beside her on the porch steps in a way that was no longer purely professional. "What do you think we can do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon where the last light was burning itself out. "There are things that can be done through official channels if we find the right official," he said. "The General Land Office in Austin has jurisdiction over homestead claims. If we can get documentation of Greer's interference to a federal land agent, it creates a different problem for him than a county sheriff can manage. The other option is to make his interference more expensive and more publicly visible." "How?" "Newspapers," he said. "A correspondent from the Austin Statesman came through here about 8 months ago. His name is Thomas Ellery. He was interested in the story of the big cattle operations pushing out the small homesteaders. It was bigger than just your father. There were families across the Panhandle facing the same situation." He paused. "A story in a major newspaper with specific documentation makes this a political problem for Greer. Men like him can handle local opposition. They have more trouble with the kind of scrutiny that gets read in the state capitol." Anna looked at him. "You have thought about this before, not just today. Your father was not the first person I watched get squeezed," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not anger exactly but was constructed from the same materials. "I have ridden this territory for 6 years. I have watched good people build something and then have it taken from them by men with more money and less conscience. I have thought about it a great deal." The night air was cooling fast in the way of the Panhandle, where the days could be warm, but the evenings still carried the memory of winter. Anna pulled her jacket tighter and looked at the first stars appearing overhead, familiar constellations she had been navigating her interior life by since childhood. "Why do you stay?" she asked. "If it bothers you that much." He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky, and in the fading light his face had the particular quality of someone being completely honest with themselves. "Because leaving doesn't fix it," he said. "It just moves the problem somewhere else. And I am not interested in putting problems somewhere else. I have been doing that long enough." He looked at her, and in the dimness of the porch his eyes were direct and a little more open than they had been all day. "What about you? You could have stayed in Missouri and hired someone to find your father." "I am not someone who hires things done that I can do myself," she said. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you are." There was a pause that was not empty but full, the way certain silences are full of all the things that are being quietly considered. "Anna," he said, and the use of her name in that particular tone made her pay attention in a way she had not quite expected. "Your father is in a difficult situation. I want you to understand that what we are proposing to do is not without risk. Greer is not a man who absorbs opposition without responding to it." "I understand that," she said. "I just want to make sure," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was less professional counsel and more personal concern, a distinction she filed away carefully. "I appreciate that you want to make sure," she said, and she meant it to carry more weight than just the words, and she thought from the way he held the moment a beat longer than necessary that it did. They slept that night in the farmhouse, James in his room, Anna in the small side room her father had clearly set up with the expectation of eventually having company, and Cornelius on the porch under a bedroll with the philosophical adaptability of a man who had slept in far worse arrangements. In the morning, over breakfast that Anna cooked while the two men went over James's journal page by page, a plan began to take shape. Cornelius would ride back to Rattlesnake Flats that day and send a wire to Thomas Ellery at the Austin Statesman, explaining the situation and the documentation available. He also had an acquaintance named Walter Prout, a federal land agent he had worked with during a survey 3 years prior, who operated out of the district office in Abilene. A formal complaint filed with the General Land Office, backed by documented evidence of interference and intimidation, would carry a different weight than anything the county sheriff was obligated to ignore. Anna would stay with her father. This had been her suggestion, not his, but Cornelius had agreed immediately, and she had appreciated that he did not argue the point. She was capable, she was armed, and her father needed someone there. They were not under active threat at this moment, and Greer's methods so far had been the kind of slow, deniable harassment that stopped short of outright confrontation. Before Cornelius rode out, he and Anna stood in the yard by the horses in the early light, and there was a moment that neither of them manufactured and both of them felt. A pause between the practical and the personal in which the person standing in front of you suddenly occupies a different kind of space. "I will be back in 3 days," he said, "4 at the outside. If anything happens before then, get your father and ride to Mrs. Henley's in town. Do you know the creek crossing that forks north?" "I can find it," she said. "Stay north of the main trail. Greer's riders tend to patrol the south road." She looked at him with something that was beginning to be more than gratitude and was not yet sure of its own name. "Thank you for coming with me," she said. "I know it was a job, and I know you took it because it is your work, but thank you anyway." He looked at her in the long considering way he had, and then something loosened in his expression that was neither professional nor reserved. "It stopped being just a job about an hour out of town," he said, and then he put on his hat, swung up onto the roan, and rode south without looking back, though she thought she could see by the set of his shoulders that it required a small, deliberate effort. She stood there for a moment in the yard with the spring wind in her hair and something bright and unexamined in her chest, and then she turned and went back to her father. The 3 days without Cornelius were not quiet ones. On the afternoon of the second day, Dillon Walsh rode up to the farmhouse with 2 other men, all 3 on good horses, all 3 with the easy arrogance of men who were accustomed to being in places they owned without ever having paid for them. Walsh was a compact, reddish man of about 40 with flat, pale eyes and the careful affability of someone who had learned to use pleasantness as a tool. He removed his hat when Anna answered the door, which told her he was smart enough to know what it looked like, and smiled. "I heard Mr. Maddox had a visitor," he said. "Just came out to pay respects." "My father is not receiving visitors today," Anna said. She did not open the door further. She stood in the frame of it with the rifle visible at her side, not raised, not hidden. Walsh's pleasant expression calibrated slightly. "A fine-looking woman like yourself ought not to be all the way out here alone," he said. "It's rough country." "I have found it rather agreeable so far," Anna said. Was there something specific you needed to convey to my father, or was this a social call? Because if it was social, I am afraid we are not at home." Walsh looked at her for a moment with the eyes that were less flat than they appeared at first, actually quite active behind the pleasant surface, assessing her the same way she was assessing him. He nodded once, slowly. "You tell your father that Mr. Greer's offer still stands," Walsh said. "He is a patient man, but the offer will not improve with time." "I will pass that along," she said. "Good day, Mr. Walsh." She kept the rifle in her hand until they had ridden out of sight, and then she went inside and found her father standing in the back room with his own rifle, and they looked at each other for a moment, and then James Maddox said, "Your mother would have done exactly the same thing." It was the best thing he could have said. On the morning of the fourth day, the sound of a horse coming up the approach brought Anna to the porch with her rifle before she had consciously decided to move. And when she recognized the roan and the particular set of the rider's shoulders, she felt something release in her that she had been holding tight without fully realizing it. Cornelius dismounted and was leading the horse toward the water trough when he stopped and looked at her standing on the porch with the rifle and the specific expression she had worn for 3 days and could apparently not entirely relinquish. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Walsh came," she said. "Yesterday, 2 days ago. He was polite about it. We had a brief discussion about hospitality and he left." Cornelius looked at her for a moment longer than strictly informational, and then he looked at the rifle. "You handled it." "I handled it," she agreed. She brought him inside and made coffee, and James came out from the back and they sat at the table, and Cornelius laid out what he had accomplished with the controlled efficiency of someone who had moved quickly and with purpose. Thomas Ellery at the Austin Statesman had responded to the wire with considerable interest. He had indeed been gathering information about the land consolidation happening across the Panhandle, and the Maddox situation fit a pattern he was already documenting. He intended to ride out to the territory within 2 weeks to interview James directly and collect copies of the journal entries. The story, when published, would be in the context of broader federal concern about land monopolization in post-war Texas, which was a political hot point that gave the story a reach beyond local interest. Walter Pruitt at the General Land Office had been harder to reach, but had ultimately been contacted through a deputy in the district office. Cornelius had filed a formal complaint on James's behalf, and Pruitt had indicated that if the documentation supported the claim of systematic harassment to suppress a legitimate homestead right, the land office could initiate a formal inquiry that would put the Greer operation under federal scrutiny. This would not be immediate, but it created a paper trail that was significantly harder to ignore than a county sheriff's filing cabinet. James listened to all of this with the expression of a man who had been in the middle of a long, lonely fight and had just been joined by reinforcements. He was quiet for a moment when Cornelius finished, and then he said, "How much do I owe you?" "We will settle accounts later," Cornelius said. "That is not a businessman's answer," James said. "No," Cornelius agreed, and he looked at Anna when he said it briefly and directly in a way that James Maddox, a man who had been watching people for 53 years, did not miss. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that was demanding but not unpleasant, the rhythm of people working towards something together. Cornelius had ridden back to town, but returned every 2 or 3 days, bringing supplies and news and updates on the progress of Ellery's travel plans. He brought a letter from Walter Pruitt confirming the formal intake of the complaint. He brought a newspaper from Abilene that contained a brief notice about increased land office attention to homestead rights in the Panhandle, clearly a precursor to the larger story that was coming. He also, Anna discovered, brought himself in a way that was no longer just professional. He helped her father with the fence repair on the south boundary, spending a full afternoon in the warm May sun driving posts and stretching wire, his shirt rolled to the elbows and his face easy and open in the way it was when he was doing physical work he liked. He sat with James in the evenings and listened to the older man talk about farming and the war in Missouri and the theory of grass management in dry climates, with the genuine interest of a man who was not merely being polite. And he and Anna talked. They talked in the mornings over coffee, in the evenings on the porch, during the stretches of the day when her father was resting, and the work was done, and there was time to be occupied by something other than necessity. They talked about everything: Virginia and Missouri, the war and what came after it, the particular quality of freedom that the frontier offered and the particular cost of it, books they had read and arguments they had made and things they believed, and things they were still working out. She found that talking to him was unlike talking to anyone she had known before. He listened as he did everything else, completely and without hurry, and when he spoke it was because he had something to say and not because he was uncomfortable with her speaking. He challenged her occasionally, not aggressively but with the directness of someone who respected her enough to disagree with her, and she found that she liked this enormously. She had spent too much of her life around people who agreed with her out of politeness or dismissed her out of habit, and neither had ever felt honest. She noticed when he was in the yard and when he was not. She noticed the quality of the late afternoons when he was there, sitting on the porch steps with the light on his face, talking to her father about water management with a focused intelligence she found genuinely attractive. She noticed that she had started watching for the roan at the top of the rise, and that, when she saw it, she felt something in her chest that she had officially stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. Thomas Ellery arrived in mid-May on a bay horse with a pack mule behind him and a battered leather satchel full of notebooks. He was a thin, enthusiastic man of about 35 with wire spectacles, and an intensity about gathering information that reminded Anna of a bird after a particularly important worm. He spent 2 days at the farm, going through James's journal line by line, asking precise and rigorous questions, taking careful notes. He interviewed Anna as well, about the letters that had stopped, about Walsh's visit, about the pattern of intimidation as she had understood it from outside. Cornelius was there for both days of Ellery's visit, and Anna watched the 2 men together and saw that Cornelius had done more than simply contact the correspondent. He had spent years observing what was happening in the Panhandle, and he had information and perspective that extended far beyond the Maddox claim, names and dates and patterns that Ellery's notebook absorbed with increasing urgency. By the end of the 2nd day, Ellery had a story that was not just about James Maddox, but about 5 other homesteading families who had lost or were losing their claims, about the methods Greer's operation used, about the insufficient response of county-level law enforcement, and about the broader political questions of how Texas was going to manage its transition from open range to settled land. "This will be on the front page of the weekly edition," Ellery said on the morning he left, straightening his spectacles with the satisfied air of a man who had found something worth saying. He looked at Cornelius. "I may need to come back for more information when the story runs and the responses start coming in." "The door is open," Cornelius said. After Ellery rode away, Anna stood beside Cornelius in the yard and they watched the dust of the correspondent's departure settle, and the morning was still and warm and smelled of the planting that James had finally been able to begin, the dark rows of turned earth and the promise of what would come up through them. "You did this," she said. "You started it," he said. "You got on a stagecoach in Missouri and came out here alone. I just helped move the pieces. You know this territory and the people in it in a way I could not have managed without years," she said. "And you chose to be involved. That is not nothing, Cornelius." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was as direct as anything he had ever said to her. "I know," he said, and the words were simple and the freight behind them was considerable, and they both stood in that morning light with something hanging between them that was very close to being said aloud. It was her father who finally named it, with the blunt affection of a man who had been watching two people orbit each other with the slow inevitability of celestial bodies, and had simply run out of patience for the metaphor. One evening, when Cornelius had stayed for supper, and they had all sat on the porch after the meal as the evening cooled, watching the moon come up over the flat horizon like a lantern being lifted, James Maddox said without any particular preamble, "Cornelius, are you planning to do something about the fact that you are in love with my daughter, or are you going to keep riding back here every 3 days and pretending you are just checking on the fence?" There was a silence in which Anna felt her face go warm, and Cornelius set down his coffee cup with a care that was entirely deliberate. And then James said, "I am old, not blind," with tremendous self-satisfaction. Cornelius looked at Anna across the small porch space, and for the first time since she had met him, his face was completely open, no careful reserve, no measured patience. Just the simple, exposed fact of how he felt, as plain as the moonrise. "I am planning to do something about it," he said, and the voice that was usually so measured had something in it that was neither measured nor restrained. James Maddox stood up, stretched theatrically, announced that it had been a long day, picked up his coffee cup and went inside, and the screen door closed behind him with a cheerful definitive click. Anna looked at Cornelius. The moon was up now, and the yard was silver and still, and the prairie wind was soft. She felt clear-headed and warm and perfectly certain, which was a combination of feelings she recognized as rare and worth attending to. "I came to Texas to find my father," she said, "and I found considerably more than I expected." He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the porch bench in a single, unhurried motion, and the space between them was different now, closer and deliberate. And when he took her hand in his, slowly, and with the particular care of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding, she laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that in the moonlight while the prairie spoke in its quiet nighttime language around them. "I have not been certain of very many things in my life," he said, "but I am certain of this." "So am I," she said. He turned toward her and she turned toward him, and the kiss they exchanged was unhurried and honest and suffused with all the weeks of talking and watching, and the particular tenderness of two people who had arrived at each other through careful attention rather than impulse. When they parted, the night was still around them, and Anna was smiling in a way she was not managing, and Cornelius was looking at her with something so warm and unguarded in his face that she felt it like a physical thing. "I think," she said, "that I should like to stay in Texas." "I was hoping you would say that," he said. 3 weeks later, Ellery's story ran on the front page of the Austin Statesman. The headline read, "Panhandle Land Barons and the Slow Erasure of the Homestead Dream," and the story was thorough, specific, and damaging in the way that thorough and specific stories are when they reach readers who have political opinions about the things they describe. The names, dates, and documented incidents in James Maddox's journal were printed in full. Greer's refusal to comment was noted. The land office complaint was referenced. 2 other affected homesteaders were quoted by name. The story was reprinted in the San Antonio Express and the Galveston Daily News within a week. Holt Greer was a man who understood power, and one thing Greer understood about power was when it had shifted. He did not visit the Maddox farm. He sent his lawyers instead, not to threaten but to negotiate, and the negotiation was civil because the terms were no longer set in Greer's office. James Maddox met with the lawyers on his own porch with his daughter beside him and the documents from the land office in his hand and his attorney, a man named Caulfield who had traveled from Abilene, at the table, and the meeting ended with a formal written commitment from the Greer operation to cease interference with the Maddox claim and to make financial restitution for the documented property damage, including the plow horse, the contaminated water, and the destroyed winter wheat. It was not a complete victory in the sense that Greer remained wealthy and influential and would likely find quieter ways to conduct his business in the future. But it was a real and documented victory in the sense that James Maddox kept his land, his water, and his springs, and the agreement was filed with the General Land Office in a way that put the full weight of federal oversight on any future interference. Walter Prout wrote a commendation letter to Cornelius that was formal and specific about the role he had played in the complaint filing, a letter that Cornelius folded carefully and put in his desk drawer, and that Anna later found there, and felt a fresh wave of admiration for the quiet, purposeful way he operated in the world. In late June, with the summer grass tall and the claim secure and James Maddox looking better than he had in a year, Anna and Cornelius sat on the porch one evening as the fireflies appeared in the grass, and the sky went from blue to indigo to the first stars, and Cornelius said, with the characteristic directness that she had come to love as one of his finest qualities, "I would like to ask your father for permission to court you formally. I would also like to ask you whether that is something you want, because I think your opinion on the matter is at least as important as his." "More important," she said. "More important," he agreed, and the acknowledgement of it was so simple and so genuine that she felt it in her chest. "Yes," she said, "it is something I want very much." He spoke to James the next morning, and James Maddox, who had clearly been waiting for this conversation for some time and had prepared for it accordingly, said yes with a promptness that made Cornelius laugh, genuinely and openly, in a way Anna heard from the yard and felt warm about for the rest of the day. Cornelius moved his operations from Rattlesnake Flats to the farm gradually, in the practical way of a man who understood that logistics were not romance, but were the foundation on which romance was built. He closed his rented space in town and transferred his maps and tracking equipment to the room James offered him in the expanded section of the farmhouse. He continued taking tracking and scouting work, riding out for several days at a time into the territory he knew as well as his own hands, and returning to the farm with the reliable certainty of a man who knew where home was. Anna established a routine that felt, for the first time in years, like it belonged to her, helping her father with the planting through the summer, managing the household accounts with the precision that came naturally to her, corresponding with Thomas Ellery, who continued to develop the Panhandle land rights story through the summer and fall, and spending the long evenings with Cornelius in a companionship that deepened like a good well, becoming richer and more vital the further down you went. On a Saturday afternoon in September of 1874, with the harvest nearly complete and the air turning golden and crisp, with the first edge of fall, Cornelius Thatcher stood in the shade of the cottonwood tree by the creek crossing on the Maddox claim with his hat in his hands and asked Anna Maddox to marry him. He did it without a speech, which she respected. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said that she was the finest person he had ever known, and that he wanted to spend his life beside her, and that he would spend every day of it endeavoring to be worthy of her, and that was exactly sufficient. She said yes with her whole heart. They were married the following month in the small church in Rattlesnake Flats, on a Saturday that the Panhandle decided to honor with a sky so blue and clear it looked painted. Mrs. Henley attended, and Thomas Ellery, who happened to be in the territory for additional reporting and was clearly delighted by the occasion. The blacksmith, a man named Perez who had quietly maintained goodwill with both newcomers and old settlers with a consistency that Anna had come to deeply respect, was there with his wife and their 3 children. Several of the other homesteading families from the surrounding area came as well, people who had heard about what had been accomplished with the land office and the newspaper, and who regarded the Maddox claim as something that had been fought for on behalf of more than just one family. James Maddox walked his daughter down the narrow aisle of the church with an expression of such complete happiness that it required several people in the small congregation to attend to their handkerchiefs. He gave her hand to Cornelius with a directness that communicated everything that needed to be said between the 3 of them, and then he stood back and allowed the ceremony to proceed with the dignity of a man who understood that this was no longer his moment. The minister, a young man named Pastor Cole, who had come west with an earnestness that had survived the encounter with the frontier more or less intact, married them with the simplicity that both of them had asked for, and the sincerity they had not needed to ask for because it was evident. When the service was done and they stood outside the church in the golden afternoon light with the whole of the Panhandle visible on every horizon, Cornelius looked at his wife, and the word was immediate and astonishing to both of them in the best way, with the expression of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. "Hello, Mrs. Thatcher," he said. Anna, who had been Anna Maddox for 24 years and had been very comfortable with that name, found to her surprise that she was perfectly delighted to change it. "Hello, Mr. Thatcher," she said, and she took his hand and they walked into the afternoon together. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was a good one by Panhandle standards, cold but not brutal, with enough snow to promise good moisture for the spring planting, and not so much that the farm was cut off for weeks at a time. James had expanded his planting from the previous year, and had acquired 2 new plow horses, which he named Ellery and Prout in a gesture of wry appreciation that amused both the correspondent and the land agent considerably when they eventually heard about it. Cornelius continued his tracking and scouting work through the winter, shorter trips now than before because the farm had needs, and the winter cold made long wilderness travel more demanding. He came home smelling of cold air and wood smoke, and the particular scent of horses and wide country that Anna had come to associate with the best parts of her life, and they sat in front of the iron stove in the evenings after supper with books or conversation, or the comfortable silence that only comes between people who have fully accepted each other. James sometimes stayed up late with them, and sometimes retired early with the diplomatic timing of a man who understood the value of leaving the young married couple to their own company, and they loved him for both tendencies. In the spring of 1875, Anna discovered she was pregnant. She told Cornelius on a Tuesday morning while he was saddling the roan for a 3-day scouting job east of the creek, and she watched his face go through several extraordinary transitions in rapid succession, none of which he managed to control, which she found completely endearing. He stood with the saddle half on the horse and looked at her with an expression that she thought might be the single most genuine thing she had ever seen on a human face. He put the saddle down. He crossed the yard to her in 3 steps and took both her hands in his and looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and everything was very clear and very bright in the morning light. "The scouting job," he finally said. "Can wait," she said. "Yes," he said, "it can." He stayed home that week, and they told James together at supper that evening, and James sat very still for a moment, and then made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a laugh, and pushed back from the table and went to stand at the window because he did not entirely want them to see the fullness of his reaction, and Anna went and stood beside him and took his arm. And he put his hand over hers, and they stood at the window together, looking at the new spring grass, while Cornelius cleared the supper table with the quiet, practical affection that was one of his most characteristic behaviors, and had not diminished in any way since the wedding. "James Maddox Jr.," her father said finally, and his voice was thick. "You are assuming it will be a boy," Anna said. "I'm hoping it will be a boy," James said without apology. "We will see," Anna said. The summer of 1875 was warm and productive. The spring planting came up well, fed by the reliable moisture of the Maddox Springs, and the fields grew full and tall under the Panhandle sun. Cornelius's scouting business continued to prosper through the warm months, and he took on work not just for travelers and landholders, but also for a surveying crew that was mapping a proposed rail line through the territory, work that paid well, and that he found genuinely interesting for the way it overlaid the land he knew so intimately with plans for what it was becoming. Anna managed the household and the farm accounts with an efficiency that consistently surprised visiting businessmen, and consistently did not surprise anyone who actually knew her. She began writing letters to the county land office on behalf of two other homesteading families in the area who were facing versions of the same pressure the Maddoxes had faced. And her letters, informed by everything she had learned from the Maddox situation, had a precision and a legal awareness that produced results in a way that the family's own unaided correspondence had not. She did not think of this as heroism. She thought of it as the practical application of information she happened to have and that other people needed. Cornelius, when he heard about the letters, looked at her with an expression she recognized as the specific form of admiration he had for her when she did something that was characteristic and unsurprising and impressive all at the same time, and said, "You know you've started something that isn't going to stop." "Good," she said. On the 9th of November, 1875, in the farmhouse on the Maddox claim with the midwife from town in attendance and James pacing the porch outside, and Cornelius sitting in the hall with his back against the wall and his hands clasped, and his expression revealing the full depth of the composure it normally required to be as calm as he usually was, Anna Thatcher gave birth to a healthy boy. He was 8 pounds and loud, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined set of the jaw. And when Cornelius was allowed into the room, and the baby was placed in his arms, the man who had been calm in the face of rough territory and difficult situations, and the long complexity of everything he had built and survived, went so completely quiet and still that Anna thought she had never seen anything so moving in her life. He held his son for a long time. The lamplight was warm in the room, and outside the November wind was talking to the grass, and James Maddox, when he was finally allowed in, stood at the foot of the bed with his hat pressed to his chest, and looked at his daughter and his son-in-law and his grandson with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated joy that the whole room was different for it. They named the boy William James Thatcher. William for no particular ancestor, just because it was a solid and honest name, and James for the man who had held this land through a difficult winter and called it home. James Maddox, when he heard the middle name, had to go out to the porch again. The years that followed moved in the good, full rhythm of people who have found the life they intended. William grew into a boy with his father's patience and his mother's quick mind, and a love for the horses that was entirely his own. And he was 3 years old when Anna had their daughter, a girl they named Eleanor Rose, who arrived in the same farmhouse in the spring of 1879, with the same midwife and a great deal more volume than her brother had managed. Eleanor had her mother's red-brown hair and her grandfather James's stubborn streak, and she was absolutely adored by all of them. Cornelius expanded the farmhouse that same year, adding a larger kitchen and 2 more rooms, because the Maddox claim was beginning to feel like the kind of place that people gathered rather than just the kind of place that people lived. And he built the expansion with the same practical care he brought to everything, learning the craft by doing it with the help of Perez the blacksmith, who had turned out to be considerably more skilled in timber work than his profession suggested. James Maddox remained on the farm and remained vigorous well into his 60s, working the fields with decreasing physical force and increasing accumulated wisdom, and he developed a habit of following William around the farm and explaining the properties of different soils and plants in the patient, detailed way of a man who has a great deal to pass on and is delighted to have a willing recipient. Thomas Ellery's story about the Panhandle land rights situation had ultimately contributed to a wider state-level review of homesteading protections that resulted in reforms in the county land office system in 1876, reforms that made the kind of official indifference the Maddoxes had experienced less institutionally possible. Ellery had written about this in a follow-up piece in which he had mentioned the Maddox case specifically as the initial documentation that had set the inquiry in motion, and Anna had cut the piece from the newspaper and put it in the frame beside the land title on the wall of the study, where it stayed. Holt Greer's operation had continued, but under the combination of land office oversight, public visibility, and the simple fact that the profitable springs of the Maddox claim were permanently off the table. It had moved its expansion focus to territory farther west, and the Maddox neighbors who had remained had, mostly, continued to remain. On a Saturday evening in October of 1880, 6 years after Anna had stepped off a stagecoach in Rattlesnake Flats with a battered trunk and a rifle and eyes that dared the frontier to try her, she sat on the expanded porch of the farmhouse that was now undeniably a home, with Cornelius beside her and William, asleep inside, and Alina in her lap, making the soft, investigative sounds of a 1-year-old encountering the world. And James in his chair at the end of the porch with his pipe, and his particular brand of contented silence. The sun was going down over the Panhandle in the lavish and theatrical way it always did, painting the enormous sky in colors that a painter would not have had the courage to use for fear of being called improbable. And the grass moved in the evening wind with the continuous conversation it had always had with itself, the same language it had spoken before any of them arrived and would speak after, and the sound of it was as comfortable as breathing. Cornelius had his arm around Anna's shoulders, and she was leaning against him in the way she had been leaning against him for years now, the specific angle and weight of it that had become as familiar and necessary as any part of the landscape. Alina reached up and grabbed his hand with both of hers with the focused intensity of a baby with priorities, and he looked down at his daughter, and then at his wife with an expression that was the same one she had seen on his face in the lamplight of the room where William was born, that complete and undefended openness. "I have been thinking," he said, and she could hear the particular quality in his voice that meant something genuine was coming. "What have you been thinking?" she asked. "That when I came to Texas in 1868, I was 22 years old and I thought the frontier was the point," he said. "The open country, the work, the solitude of it. I thought that was what I was after." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her, and then at the baby in her lap, and then at James at the end of the porch, and then out at the prairie in the fading light. "And now I know that the frontier was just where I was going when I was on my way to this," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had come to know in all its weathers and expressions, the patient face and the open one, and the one he wore when he was tracking something in his mind, and the one he wore at the end of a long day, and the particular and irreplaceable one, that was only for her. "That was very well said, Cornelius," she told him. "I have been saving it," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she loved. James Maddox, from his end of the porch, said, without opening his eyes from the middle distance he was regarding with great satisfaction, "It was well said. It also took you long enough." Alina said something emphatic and probably important in the language of 11-month-olds, and the whole porch laughed, and the sky continued its performance, and the grass continued its conversation, and the evening settled over the farm like something that had always intended to be there. In the months that followed, the farm expanded again with a new barn that Cornelius built with help from several of the neighboring homesteaders, a project that turned into something halfway between a construction effort and a community gathering, with families riding in for 2 weekends and contributing labor and food and noise, and the particular good feeling of people working together toward something visible. The barn stood solid and red against the Panhandle sky and smelled of new timber and hay, and James Maddox walked through it the evening it was completed with his hand running along the beams, and said that it was built to outlast all of them, which he clearly regarded as a high compliment. William, at 5 years old, had developed an attachment to the roan gelding that Cornelius had ridden in on that first day, an old horse now but still sound, who accepted the boy's attentions with a philosophical tolerance that Cornelius said was probably the wisest relationship in the whole household. William named the horse captain, a name the horse declined to acknowledge with any ceremony. Anna had continued writing on behalf of neighboring families with land disputes, and by 1881 this had evolved into a more formal arrangement. She was corresponding regularly with the district land office, with a lawyer in Abilene named Samuels who had become an ally, and with 2 other women in the territory who were managing similar advocacy on behalf of their communities. The work had no official title and no official compensation, but it had real effect, and the families who had been helped by it knew who to thank. Cornelius supported this work with the complete and practical absence of any suggestion that she ought to be doing something else, which was not a complicated thing, and should not have been remarkable, but which Anna appreciated every single time, because she knew enough of the world to know that it was not universal. In the spring of 1882, Anna found herself pregnant again, and this time she told Cornelius not in the yard in the morning, but in the evening after supper while they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and he looked at her across the lamplight with a smile that started slowly and became something enormous and uncontrolled, the least managed expression she had seen on him since the day William was born. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. Your father is going to be insufferable, he said. He has already been insufferable for years, she said. This will merely provide him with new material. James, when told, was exactly as insufferable as predicted, and everyone loved him for it. The baby arrived in November of 1882, another boy, healthy and vigorous, who they named Daniel Cornelius Thatcher. Daniel had the reddish tint in his hair that ran in the Maddox line, and a serious, watchful quality about him from his earliest weeks that made James say he was going to be either a farmer or a judge, and Cornelius said the two were not necessarily incompatible, and Anna said that the boy was 11 days old, and perhaps they could allow him to develop opinions of his own before assigning him a profession. James bounced his grandson and said he was going to be a farmer. The Panhandle changed through the early 1880s in ways that were visible and sometimes disorienting. The rail line that Cornelius had scouted for came through the territory in 1882, and towns that had been isolated outposts became points on a map that was increasingly connected to the rest of the country. Rattlesnake Flats grew with the arrival of the railroad, new buildings going up on the main street, new families arriving with the particular hopeful energy of people who believe they have found the right place at the right moment, which was something Anna recognized from her own arrival 8 years prior. Cornelius's scouting work shifted as the land became better mapped and better connected. He transitioned into ranch consulting, working with the newer operations that were arriving in the territory, advising on water management and grass rotation, and the sustainable use of land in a way that his years of observation had given him a particular understanding of. He had strong opinions about land use that were informed by his experience watching what happened when those opinions were ignored, and he expressed them with the same direct patience that characterized everything he said. The Maddox farm continued to produce reliably, anchored by those 3 springs that Holt Greer had once wanted so badly, and that now fed the fields and the livestock and the kitchen garden, and the particular tree that Alina had decided was her personal property, and climbed with an ambition that occasionally required intervention. James Maddox turned 60 in 1883, and they celebrated with a gathering that drew more people than Anna had expected, neighbors and acquaintances, and the families from 3 homesteads whose land situations Anna had helped navigate, all arriving at the farm on a warm October Saturday with food and noise, and the particular warmth of people gathered around a man who had held something together through a difficult time and made a space for others in the doing of it. James stood in the yard in the afternoon light, accepting handshakes and compliments with a dignity that was not quite concealing how moved he was, and Anna stood back and watched, and felt an expansion in her chest that was too large and too warm to be named precisely, but that she suspected was what contentment actually felt like in the body. Cornelius stood beside her with Daniel on his hip, the baby in the solemn phase of trying to comprehend where the horizon went, and William nearby chasing a leaner around the cottonwood tree that had been growing for 9 years and was now tall enough to cast good shade. "Look at this," Anna said, meaning all of it. "I know," Cornelius said, meaning the same thing. That evening, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed and James had retired with the satisfied exhaustion of a man who had been properly celebrated, Anna and Cornelius sat on the porch under the October stars, the night cool and enormous, and the prairie silver in the moonlight that was nearly full. She leaned against his shoulder, and his arm was around her, and they sat in the particular silence of people who have known each other long enough to be completely at ease in it, for whom quiet together was not an absence of communication, but was itself a form of it. "I have been thinking," she said, exactly as he had said it to her years before on this same porch. "What have you been thinking?" he asked. "That when I got on that stagecoach in Missouri in 1874, she said, "I thought I was going to rescue my father. I thought that was the whole story." "And," he said. She looked out at the moonlit prairie, the grass moving in the slow night wind, the stars overhead in their familiar architecture. She thought about the woman she had been stepping off that stagecoach with a battered trunk and a heart full of fear and determination. And she thought about the life that had been waiting for her in this territory that she had not imagined and could not have planned for. The man and the work and the children and the community, and the decade of building something real and lasting in a place that required everything you had and gave everything back and more. "And the story was considerably larger than I knew," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair, the quiet, habitual tenderness of a man who had been in the habit of loving her for a long time and had not grown accustomed to it in any way that had reduced it. "It was," he said. The moon moved over the farm and the creek and the springs and the fields and the new barn and the cottonwood tree and the graves of horses who had carried them faithfully across hard country. It moved over the journal that James Maddox still kept, in which the entries were now full of harvests and grandchildren rather than fear and resistance. It moved over the land title on the wall beside Ellery's newspaper article. It moved over the 3 sleeping children in their rooms, William with his serious face and his father's patience, Alina with her grandmother's red-brown hair and her grandfather's stubbornness, Daniel with his watchful eyes already turned toward a horizon he had not yet found. It moved over the couple on the porch who had found each other in the particular way that the frontier sometimes allowed, not the romantic myth of it but the real version. 2 people working towards something in difficult country, becoming necessary to each other before they had finished realizing it, building a life out of patience and honesty and the daily choice to stay. In the morning there would be work, as there always was, the good demanding work of a farm in the Texas Panhandle in the last quarter of the 19th century, the work that was also its own form of love, the tending of things so they could grow. But for now the night was soft and the stars were bright and the prairie breathed in and out around them, and Anna Thatcher leaned into her husband's warmth and felt the full settled weight of a life that had been built rather than found, chosen rather than given, and was entirely, completely, and without reservation exactly enough.